Dream Tower Media presents The Literary Wonder and Adventure Show with guest host Guy Windsor and Edgar the Raven.
Howdy do.
This episode, Rogues of Merth and the Founders of Modern Fantasy. A conversation with author and illustrator Robert Zoltan.
Hello everyone, I'm Guy Windsor, the surprise host for this episode of the Literary Wonder and Adventure Show. I'm calling you from England, but though you can't see me, I'm live here on the big screen in the Dream Tower.
And if I might say so, looking handsome as ever.
Well, thank you, Edgar.
And I'm Edgar the Raven, the diabolical mastermind responsible for today's devious switcheroo. But since you're the host, Guy, I'll let you explain.
Well, Edgar contacted me not long ago with the idea of turning the tables on Robert Zoltan and making him the guest of the show. Seems only fair to me. And when I said I was the surprise host, it's not just a surprise to you. Robert himself has no idea that he's about to go live on the air.
I sent Robert to the pet supply store for some gourmet bird feed not long ago. He should be returning any minute.
So, everyone listening at home, hide behind the sofa, and when Robert walks in the door, join us in shouting out, "Surprise!"
Speak of the devil.
Okay, here we go.
Scuba-doo-ba.
Surprise!
What the? Guy Windsor?
Hello, Robert.
Edgar, what are you up to?
Flashing red light. It's showtime.
Showtime? We're on the air?
Live and kicking.
We don't have a show scheduled.
I do apologize, old chap. It was his idea.
Who's the guest? You?
No, you are.
Me?
That's right. This time, you're on the hot seat, baby. So pull up a chair and get ready for your interrogation, or conversation.
Oh man, I'm not ready for this. Well, what's the subject? I hope it isn't world economics.
Yes, it is, but it's the economics of a world you built yourself. I thought we could talk about the founders of modern sword and sorcery and what influenced your Rogues of Merth series.
Oh, okay. I can handle that. Edgar, I'll get you back for this.
I'm counting on it.
All right, Guy, you're the host. Take it away.
Okay, Robert. Now, firstly, I promise not to ask you where your ideas come from, okay?
Well, that's okay. I don't mind. I like that question. It's a good question, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
No, see, all of the other author friends I have say it's their least favorite question because ideas just arrive. But anyway.
Well, I think it's the if you don't take that question below the surface, then it's can be kind of irritating because.
Sure.
But I think that's actually in a way that's the only question. If you really don't answer in a surface way, then you start to dig deep down, and it's actually a very difficult question to answer.
Sure, and I thought we would start with discussing your influences a little bit, but I'd like to start with, in Rogues of Merth, you have Dareon and Blue, who are very much a double act. It's not the hero and a sidekick.
Right.
It's clearly a two-hander. So I'm curious as to what other double acts you may have appreciated in fiction or in comedy or wherever else you might find them.
Well, I think the obvious influence that people have pointed to is Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, who definitely had an influence on my creation of those characters. But the thing about author influences, people, there's a difference between imitating someone or being inspired by them.
Sure.
And the inspiration, and we all do both, even the best authors, but the real inspiration comes because you feel a kinship or an affinity, a similar affinity for the same things that your favorite author does. That's what I realized. Because when you really love an author like Leiber or Robert E. Howard or Lawrence Durrell, whoever, then you read them over and over, and you start to look into who their influences were, and then you start to I think as a real artist or author, a writer starts to questions those things and asks why do I love this work so much? And you start delving below the surface, and then you realize that the reason you love the work, or the reason you love the author or the author's writing, is because they have a fascination for or interest in or questions about the same things that you do. So what would one of those questions be? Well, I think with Leiber is that the idea of if you look at Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser and you look at Dareon and Blue, even though they're in some ways very different, I think Blue is totally different than Fafhrd. I don't think there's really much similarity at all, except for the fact that they both are called a barbarian occasionally. Right. It's really the city mouse, country mouse thing.
Okay.
Yeah, when I read when I was a little kid, I read some, I don't remember what it was, and I think it's a very old, and is that a British thing? It's a very old, or maybe it's French, it's a very old kind of fable idea of the city boy, the country boy, but it's also like the city mouse, country mouse. There's a little like fable about that.
Yes, and there's a series of stories that I read when I was a kid with the town mouse and the country mouse, and the town mouse getting lost in the country or the country mouse getting lost in town. Right.
So they
have to sort of help each other out.
Right. Do you know where that? Do you know who originally wrote that, or is it kind of lost in time?
Honestly, I can't recall. It was a book I read when I was maybe 6.
See, I think I read a similar thing when I was in grade school, but I don't remember. I'm gonna have to see. I should have looked that up.
Sure.
I want to know where that comes from, and that's because that's an amazing archetype. It's a very powerful modern archetype, right? Because it could have existed for a long time because there have been cities for about good 5,000 years. At least,
sure.
Kind of cities that we consider cities. So that's what that archetype really goes back to is city, country, but also those represent something even deeper. You keep digging further. And in this case of Dareon and Blue, and probably Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser too, and some other characters. And in the Four Musketeers, it's split into more than one direction, just kind of the religious man and then the drunkard.
Sure.
And, But beneath the idea of the city and the country is with Dareon, Vin, and the Indari warrior Blue. Dareon represents the mind. I don't want to explain this too much. Dareon represents the mind, and Blue represents the instinctual side, intuitional.
That's fine. I really didn't get that when I was reading it. Dareon, he's often impetuous and impulsive, whereas Blue is much more measured and really. Okay, yes, it comes across as an instinct, but it reads as more rational to me.
Well, that's interesting. I think you're right, but I think that has to do with his intuition and his instinct, and the fact that Dareon is impulsive because, when I say mind, Dareon kind of lives in his mind. So he's reacting all the time off of. He's like the modern, very much the city, the cultured person. It's everything's conceptual. So Dareon has conceptualized everything. So his fears are conceptual, his hopes are conceptual, his desires are. Whereas Blues are much more body oriented and instinctual. So Blue doesn't act as impulsively as often because Blue tends to act more often only when he needs to act. Because he's not driven by an idea of danger. He's only driven by the actuality of it.
Actual danger. Okay.
Yeah. So that would be. So I mean, like I said, yeah, I don't want to make it so simplistic that's one or the other. Dareon also has intuition, ends up with having amazing moments of intuition, and Blue has times where he's not easy to get along with or whatever. So, but I think that basically Dareon is kind of more like me.
Okay.
And also that's another thing is Dareon is very much almost like me in some kind of exaggerated way. Some ways good, some ways bad, and then Blue is very much like my older brother Steve.
Okay, I was about to ask you who was okay. So if Dareon is like you, who is Blue like?
Yeah, and in the book dedication at the beginning, it says for the Andari warrior known as Steve.
Oh right, yes, of course. That's your brother, is it?
Yeah, and that's my older brother. He's a doctor, and he's incredibly intellectual, but he's much more quiet and has a lot more equanimity than me, a lot more measured, at least on the outside. And so
it's kind of what you want in a doctor.
Yes, I think that would probably be a good trait, definitely. So I think so a lot of what it comes off with Blue's calmness probably comes from him. And also the fact that I wanted Blue to have, unlike someone like Conan, who is extremely just rash and becomes angry at the drop of a hat, and yet has a calmness in sense when he's in nature and a sense of belonging there. Blue is he's a little bit enlightened in a way, I guess. He's more like what Blue is also is a very very much a Native American archetype.
That comes across quite strongly.
Yeah, Native archetype of a Native American warrior who would come from a tribe who would have a little more of almost that Eastern wisdom, a sense of belonging to the land, a sense of not the strong sense of individual identity, but a sense of calmness with the natural things.
Is that why he's blue, not red?
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, Red Indian is a kind of almost pejorative term for Native American.
Oh no, he's called blue because of his tattoos.
Yes, but you could have made those tattoos any color.
Oh,
it's your world.
Yeah, I guess it was kind of obvious to me that most tattoos are blue. They could be any color. You're right, but I pictured him being almost like copper skinned, and therefore I thought blue would go with that color. It's just like a visual thing, and also
because I mean blue is sort of a theme. I mean, the color blue is almost a theme in the book. I mean,
it's true.
Like my favorite of the stories is the blue lamp.
Yes, the blue lamp. Yeah.
So why is the blue lamp blue?
The blue lamp is. Now you talk about where your ideas come from. The blue. Well,
lamp, there you go.
I have the blue lamp. It's on top of my refrigerator now. It belonged to my girlfriend at the time.
Okay.
It's a beautiful, and I took a picture of it and I put it on Facebook a while ago, but I'll post it with this show. It's one of those beautiful, maybe Northern African or Arabic looking, probably like Moroccan, sort of bulbous lamps with a top that you open up and you can put a candle or a light in there, and it's very authentic looking, and it's got this very dark metal grilled design, but it's just got a blue screen around it.
So it never occurred to me that it would just be a real lamp in your actual house.
I went to sleep at my girlfriend's every time I was at my girlfriend's. I went to bed, went to sleep, and that blue light was. She would go to bed earlier than me, and I would come in, and the blue lamp would be on, and that blue lamp that's exactly where the story came from.
Excellent.
So actually, that's actually an interesting thing. Because some people would say, where'd you get the idea for this story and that story? And I think maybe many writers do that. I don't know. For myself, it's a very strong component. Whereas when I read somebody like Robert E. Howard, I really feel like he just kind of came up. He was an amazing writer, but he was a little bit formulaic. And the stories, I don't feel like he needed to like see something somewhere, and then maybe he did occasionally, but I feel like he came up with, it was a similar thing, a lost civilization, then there was some, unknown creature, that blah, blah, blah. And I don't really, as you can tell by the book, probably I don't write like that. It's all quite varied.
It's very varied, yes.
Yes.
Like it's. I mean, the Voyage to the End of Time, for instance, you have a ship that appears just in time to rescue Dareon and Blue from drowning in the sea, and then takes them off on this really weird sort of. It's almost science fiction, alternative reality, alternative timeline sort of thing. And then eventually deposits them back in the sea, if I recall correctly.
After some really crazy stuff happens.
Yeah, exactly. There's some
be
really crazy
spoiler,
stuff.
Be a spoiler. You don't want to say.
Yeah.
That was my love of. Again, it's easy to say, oh, I got this from this, but then even as I say it in my mind, I start seeing all these other threads, and I realize how many different influences are going on.
Sure.
And I think that's why a little bit I don't get irritated by it. I understand people comparing like what I'm Dareon in Blue, Rogues of Merth to Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. But the truth is, he had a whimsical way of writing, and it's very much the way I write too. Again, it's like, is it an influence or is it almost like a combination of influence and coincidence? You know, that I also love, Shakespeare's been a huge influence. Not that I have a story that I was thinking of writing that I've written a couple pages of with Dareon in Blue, and it's a play, but it'd be incomprehensible to the modern reader. So I'm not even going to finish it. It's just all full of puns and, cryptic conversations.
But you know what would be really cool?
What?
Dump Dareon in Blue at the Globe.
Well, my friend, I just submitted a story to Tales from the Magician's Skull called The Star Diamonds. And if it gets accepted, well, you'll read it eventually anyway. And that's the closest I'll come. They actually do end up at a place that I based on the Globe, but it's called the Twilight Theater. So
okay,
I actually wrote it. So 2/3 of the adventure takes place in a theater, which is very exciting at night, unabandoned, which is a very exciting location. But the Voyage to the End of Time. I think initially, what really drew me to that idea of them getting on this ship. First of all, I wish I knew more about sailing. I love ships. I love ship adventures. I've read one of my favorite books is Alan Villiers' The Sons of Sinbad, who Alan Villiers was the British explorer, and he went on an Arab dhow all around Africa, sailing for like 2 years with them, and it's it's one of the most amazing adventures I've ever read. I'm just starting to read it for a second time. So it's The Sons of Sinbad, Sindbad. So it came from my love. Several of the stories came from actually that book. Even in the first book, my love of Freya Stark. Freya Stark, the British explorer of the early 20th century. She traveled by herself all over the Hadramaut and
yes.
Amazing. The Southern Gates of Arabia is her most famous, and I think so far her best book. And it's one of my top 5 books, if not my first. Might be my number one adventure book, not a fiction book. So that. And the Alan Villiers book. I read a lot of early 20th century and late 1800s travel fiction. Okay. I'm sorry, not travel fiction. Travel. Travel. I'm sure some of it
memoir.
I'm sure some of it is fiction, especially some of the Flaubert in Egypt or whatever. Some of that.
Well,
I think they made some of this up, but. So the Voyage to the End of the Time came from a love of also the idea of, I forget. There's a name for it in drama where all of the scene takes place in like one little location and the characters are trapped and enclosed in this space kind of.
Okay. Well, in Star Trek, they call it a bubble episode.
Yeah, that's one word for it, bubble episode. So that's what it was. My whole intention was to have this where they were on that ship, and it was just this dream. It makes it very dreamlike, and it makes like a theater. And I think several of my stories in that first book are rather theatrical, and that one especially. And you have this cast of strange, mysterious characters on the ship, and you slowly learn about each one of them. But also, I have to definitely tip my hat to Michael Moorcock because. I have a huge love of alternate universe stuff and alternate dimension and alternate selves. And that came from both reading physics and of Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion cycle. And that's, I guess, what we were kind of discussing is like Leiber would be one, Michael Moorcock another. Each of these writers I loved for a different reason. But Michael Moorcock I loved for his... very just surreal, dreamlike, and very strange. Of course, the character Elric, the albino, is so strange for that time, especially. But just the alternate, just his kind of Elric is always seeking like the meaning of his life and the meaning of existence, and that is extremely fascinating to me. I think that we all are doing that, even if people don't consciously seek it. At 3 a.m. when you wake up or whatever, everyone's wondering what the hell they're doing here. And so the Voyage to the End of Time is, my fascination with that. What is time? And what would the end of time mean?
Now, you've structured the book as it's not actually a collection of short stories, because each story is connected by an interlude.
Yes.
Which is quite an unusual pattern. And I'm struggling to think of any other examples of it. Can you think of some?
The closest thing I can...
Because it's a really interesting way of doing it, because you've got the freedom to jump around that you get from writing a series of short stories, and yet there seems to be a kind of narrative arc holding them together, because you say very briefly what happens between each episode.
Right. I think there's a couple things going on there. One is that even though I didn't care for the pastiches of Conan, what I first read by Robert E. Howard, who would be one of the third, I guess, author we're talking about, that to me is the kind of founder of what we consider modern fantasy. All of those stories they wrote those pastiche stories to fill in the gaps kind of in Conan's career, and they had intro paragraphs usually that bridged the Howard story, and then it was like a little intro on the first page of the pastiche, and then Fritz Leiber kind of did something a little bit like that when they put out the White Wolf Leiber stories. He didn't really do that. I'm trying to think. Occasionally there's like a page he wrote a 2 or 3, like he would write like 2 or 3 page shorts, these really short shorts to kind of make sense of. He tried to put their career into a chronological, make some sense of it. And then also with Elric, it'd be like a novella, and then there'd be a page saying, Elric went across, left the Young Kingdoms and went to so and so. So I think that idea of segues exists. So that was kind of something I already was aware of. And then the second thing about having the interludes that connects the stories was that I wanted to write little vignettes.
Right.
Almost like little literary vignettes that were in their present tense. And it gives a feel different.
Often in verse.
Yeah. Oh, and there's the poetry too. So that's a different thing. There's the interludes to connect everything, and then at the beginning, that's a big part of it too. Is that Dareon is a poet. He's a poet swordsman. He's an aspiring poet trying to get quote unquote published, whatever you call it then. And all of the poems and anything that you'll read in an excerpt from his collected work that's called The Recollections and Admonitions of Dareon Vin.
Yes.
And that's so that contains his poetry, and so each of the poems describes the story without giving anything away. It's kind of mysterious and kind of hints at what goes on, and that came from the fact that Dareon Vin is actually based on Francois Villon, the French poet.
Okay.
And,
right. Okay.
Yeah, and Villon.
I don't know his work.
He's kind of considered the national poet of France. If you can find his work. He was alive in medieval times.
Right.
And he was.
So what's his name?
Francois Villon, Villon. And so Villon Vin is just a derivation of Villon.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, I'm probably giving away too much, but No,
that's good.
Yeah, I even based, apart from, I think there's all but 2 of the poems are based on the rhyme scheme that he used the most.
Really?
Yeah, and I love poetry, and I could be a poet if I would apply myself to it, but I wanted, that's another thing I wanted. I loved writing the poetry, because it's a very different thing. And it's a real joy. And ironically, I don't think I'm going to have the poems in the second book. Instead, I'm writing just journal entries, very kind of funny, clever, very literary journal entries before each story, where Dareon just addresses the general theme of what the story is about and as it relates to people and his life. And I think he's writing from an island now. He's in self-imposed exile at this point. Okay. So I don't know how many books there will be, but at some point, I don't know if he ends up there at the very end. But he's in self-imposed exile on almost like a Greek island, but obviously it's not Greek. He's somewhere in the eastern underlands, and I don't know why he's there exactly. So I guess I'll find out eventually too.
Well, yes, we write to find out what's happening.
Exactly. the truth is, Guy, I didn't write the stories like that. I didn't write them in a sequence. The Blue Lamp was the first story I wrote.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the stories were all written. I just wrote whatever story I wanted to write.
Sure.
And then, as I had about getting to about 6-7 stories, I realized that, and I was on a kind of I had some momentum going, and I realized I could have this done, and I could release a book within a year if I wrote 2 or 3 more stories. So, so what happened was I went back and I looked at all the stories, and it was very difficult, actually. This is very difficult. I actually took the stories, and I tried to find some sense of chronology of how old I think they were or where they were.
Right.
And then the last 3 stories only, I think, were written purposely to complete a chronological sequence of their life.
Right. Interesting.
And then I went back and made little tweaks on 2 or 3 of the stories.
Sure.
In order to make them make sense in a chronological order. And the last story I wrote, the story that was the hardest, a story that I've written, I think I have 5 versions of it and that I threw out, and they were all like novellas, was One Night in Mirth, the story of their origin, the story of Dareon and Blue meeting.
Well, yeah, that would be the hardest.
It was. It almost stopped me from putting out. I almost just put another story in and released the first book. But I really, really, really wanted to not have the story of them meeting in some later volume. I really would like this to be. Yeah, I don't mind it. But the thing is, you have to understand. I had put the stories in sequence, so I already had something that starts even from the prologue. It talks about how there's many tales of how they met. Some they say they met this way, and it's like, but it really happened like this, and that's the first story. And I really wanted this kind of lighthearted, whimsical thing, and not a flashback, even though it's been done many times, because I already had that almost like experimental novel set up. So I was so happy with One Night in Mirth because it's the story I've been trying to write for 5 years.
Right.
And it was that story was based on A Midsummer Night's Dream originally, and
really,
and it was called Fool's Night. And it was so complex, and I wrote half of a version of that, A Fool's Night. And before that, like I said, I had like 3 other stories I threw out that were okay, but they were just standard fantasy. It was like,
yeah.
So One Night in Mirth. So I tried it again. I pulled out the whole Fool's Night thing again, and I started to try to. What I did was I kind of made a list of what was going on in the characters, which I don't usually do, and I started to simplify it, and. Because I realized I wasn't Shakespeare.
Right. Yes.
I mean, I'm a good writer, but you look at and also the thing is, he was getting his plots from somewhere else a lot of time, but Midsummer Night's Dream, he did not. That, as far as they know, they don't know where that came from. They think it was original to him.
Okay.
It's very complex. And so my story, One Night in Mirth, is already complex enough. I actually had a third character in that, Sael, who everyone will meet in A Night at the Library, which is coming out in November in Heroic Fantasy Quarterly. A Night in the Library will be the first story in Volume 2 of Rogues of Mirth.
Oh, splendid!
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. So that takes up right where it leaves off, kind of at Volume 1. And in the One Night in Mirth originally, there was like Dareon going for this pearl, and there was Blue, and then there was also Sael and her servants.
Right.
So it's 3 different, and they're all going to show up at the same time where the pearl was, and this mad race to the city with Dareon, Blue, and this. Oh, not just there's 4 parties, and this the entity I don't want to say too much about.
Well, that's interesting because a 2-body problem in physics is quite easy to sort out. A 3-body problem is basically impossible.
Right. Yeah, and I already.
Right. So as soon as you have a third main character pulling in a different direction, you make your life infinitely more difficult.
Not only too much for me, but I realized it was just too much for the reader. The reader didn't need that much, so I just cut her out, and then the story fell into place very nicely, and I did that audio drama, and I'm very proud of that. I'm continually getting subscribers on YouTube every month, so I know that those shows will be there forever, and people will be able to hear it. But I've been a little bit disheartened that I couldn't even everybody's so busy. Very few people do reviews of audio dramas, and that hasn't gotten much attention. And I've done 4, and that's the best audio drama I've done musically and everything. The music and it's just the biggest cast and. It just was a monumental project that took me about 3 months. And so I'm hoping that people will, if they don't like reading, they can listen to that and they get the whole thing.
Sure. Well, audio is supposed to be the kind of the next big thing with storytelling. Although it's actually the oldest thing, that's oldest way of telling stories. But it's now, now the technology is maturing and people are releasing things on Audible and things like that. So you're getting a lot more writers are producing their stories as novels and as audiobooks. Doing a full-on audio drama, though, is again an order of magnitude more complex because you've got different voices and musical backgrounds and things like that.
And I'm actually doing something unique. I've realized I may not be the only person doing it, and I guess that's the meaning of unique. I guess would be the exact meaning of it. But it's pretty rare because I'm not doing a scripted audio drama. And I'm not doing just a narrated audiobook. I'm doing I call it an audiobook drama. The entire story's in there. All the prose. Occasionally I'll drop a name attribution like he said, she said, but that often even is in there because there's descriptors with that attribution, and I don't drop any of that. I'm not trying to turn it into a script. So that was very important to me that this is the full story. This is the full book.
Right.
And so that would be the difference, I think. And some people who do audio dramas even were saying, oh, this isn't an audio drama. It's got too much narration. And I'm thinking, well, I don't know, how much can you have? And then it's like so silly.
Well, yes, and there isn't a police force going around like measuring the amount of narration you've got in your audio drama and telling you whether you've got, it's art. Make it the way you want to make it. And now, 600 years ago, a chap called Fiore de Liberi wrote an amazing book called Il Fior di Battaglia, which is a description of his combat system.
What's it called again?
Il Fior di Battaglia, the flower of battle. Mm-hmm. But in the introduction, he claims he is able to read, write, and draw, which makes him unusual. Mm-hmm. And it occurs to me that you are similarly skilled, if not necessarily in medieval armored mounted combat, But unusually...
I did fence, but... Yeah.
Unusually, you have actually illustrated your own book. So I guess my question would be, what comes first, the picture or the story?
Oh, the story completely.
Okay.
I've been a professional illustrator much longer than a writer, but I've been inspired by artwork, but I'm much more inspired by nature. I seldom write stories based on... Actually, that's a really good question because the cover. It was hard for me to decide how I wanted to do even the artwork for the cover, and I ended up going for a very strong graphic design, it's a black and white inking of them that has a very. It's got a very classic fantasy, but also a heavy, bold. Yeah. Very graphic look, and then the book is all one color, so it's really duotone, except for like some of the type has a little slightly different yellow in it. But I settled on that, and I was really thrilled by that design with the diamond shape, and so all the books will follow that. Because I was going to do a painting, and I went back and forth, and for some reason it felt like I didn't want to do a painting. So once I settled on that inking, the idea of the cover being that, I had done some illustrations already for a couple of stories since I released them before the book came out fully, and yeah, so I felt like the black and white really fits the feel of their adventures.
And it's evocative somewhat of Blue's tattoos.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I didn't think of that. I agree. That would be another reason, and also just gives more an old feel, an ancient kind of, and also the illustrations I did, other than the cover where you see them depicted, and I'm okay with the way they're depicted. I like the way they look, the way I did it enough. I don't think it's necessarily the way they look. What I'm saying? It's just one idea. And the second book, they may look slightly different. I'll try to keep a similar look. But on the inside, I definitely did not want illustrations of scenes or anything like that.
Sure.
To be honest with you, I have mixed feelings about illustrations in books. I'm going to have illustrations in my first Quintilian Quill novel that's coming out, the long rescue that's coming out probably March. I'm going to have paintings in that, but it kind of goes with the more fairy tale kind of a comedic feel of that. But for Rogues of Merth especially, I didn't want depictions of the characters. I didn't want scenes. I didn't want to distract. I feel like it distracts too much from the stories, and despite the fact that I'm an illustrator, I think with some stuff it's okay, but I don't want somebody to tell me what the scenes look like or what the characters look like so much, and that's why all the pictures are very iconic and a little bit mysterious.
It reminds me a little bit of Kipling's illustrations for the Just So stories, where you don't know the Just So stories. Oh my goodness, you have to read them. They're sort of intended for kids. You can certainly read them to children. Well, actually, some of it has dated a bit. You might want to be a bit careful. Read it to yourself before you read it to a child, just in case.
Right.
But he has similar sort of drawing style with lots of heavy black and almost a kind of a woodcut feel. But again, they're not necessary to the story. They just sort of illustrate an aspect of it, but never in a sort of what's the word?
Representative, maybe, of scenes and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't force you to see the scene a certain way.
Literal. It's not literal. Yeah, not literal illustrations. I'm not sure what the exact word to give it, even though I'm an illustrator.
Yeah.
But yeah, for like the Sails on Scarlet Sands story, there's just that like winged scarab, and you see the desert. No, that's it. And there's and the two suns, and that's what you see.
And speaking of that story, the game with the it's not chess and it's not. It's a bit like sort of D&D action figures moving around. What does that look like to you?
What do you mean? What does it look like?
Well, you must see it in your head, because see, I would really like to see that produced as a 3D like proper game.
Yeah, I think it is a. You don't see many games like that, because it is almost like chess, but the pieces are, more random.
Yeah, and it's not a chessboard. It's the layout of the building that they're in.
I don't know. It's funny. It would seem obvious to create a game like that, but maybe it's because it'd be too hard to have rules. But I mean, I'm not going to say what any of the pieces were. Apart from that, there were men, and then there's some other, things that happened in the story. But it would seem like a fascinating game to have just these. Iconic, these pieces that you could pull out, and maybe some of them would be, and you wouldn't know which ones were in the game.
Exactly.
So they would be random. So some would be in a game, sometimes they wouldn't. So you have to be they can be like mixed in a box and pulled out separately, almost like cards. And so you would each have like Scrabble, and you would each have these pieces, and you don't know what you've got, and then you've got a setting, and then you have these pieces.
I think you should sketch it.
Do you know anything about game design? I don't know nothing about.
Well, I know. A few years ago, I produced a card game with 4 character decks and 2 expansion packs, which accurately represents Fiore de Liberi's longsword. I won't say system, because the system is all of his art: on foot, in armor, out of armor, on horseback, 4 different weapons, also wrestling. So that's the system. But the how fighting with a longsword in his style works. I've produced a card game which accurately maps my interpretation of how that longsword fight would go. And the key to it is every single game you can play with the cards, you can reproduce sword in hand without any kind of logical problems.
Wow, that's neat.
Yeah, I hired a genius game designer. That's the secret to that one. Is there's depending on, so if you play a particular blow and I defend myself with a particular blow, there are icons on the cards which, if they line up, means that our blades are kind of stuck together and we're sort of in the bind.
Right,
and if they don't line up, then my defense has beaten your attack wide, and I'm free to then strike.
Wow, that sounds neat.
Yeah. It's
the balance of challenge and the flow idea of enough challenge but not too much challenge, where you can
and also how much of it is purely skill, how much of it is
chance and
luck, intervention, how much of it is how much information is available to the other person. Like in chess, you can both see all the board. In poker, let's say if you're playing Texas Hold'em, you can see the turn, the flop, the river, and the turn.
Right.
But you can't see the two cards that each player has.
Right.
So some information is available to everybody, and some information is private.
Well, that's another. That's a third aspect almost, and you're right. It's like the challenge, the level of challenge and satisfaction balanced, and then chance and skill, and then what's known and unknown. There's a bunch of things that I personally don't understand at all, and in the sense of
if you're interested, there's a very, very good book on the subject, which is called. Actually, it's on my bookshelf. Let me have a look.
Yep, because I don't. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It's called The Characteristics of Games by Elias, Garfield, and Gutscherer. So 3 authors, Elias, Garfield, and Gutscherer. I'm probably mangling Gutscherer's name, but never mind. So it's called Characteristics of Games. It's really, really good. And when I was getting into creating Audacia, the sword fighting card game, I read it and I was much enlightened as to how these things actually work.
Oh, interesting. Well, if I ever get feel stupid enough, foolish enough to get involved in trying to create
but also hang on, these days you can get. I mean, we did a print run for Audacia, but we also have all of the decks available as print on demand. But there are also these days print on demand board games.
Right, the 3D printer. Right.
You don't have to. No, I mean, they're made of cardboard.
Oh, you just mean, okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, so board games can be printed on demand, so you don't have to buy like 1,000 boxes, which you then have to sell.
Right.
So your setup costs are much lower, and it's just a much more kind of economically approachable thing to produce a game. And then, of course, if the game is printed on demand and it starts doing really well, it might make sense to shift it to a print run type thing, and maybe add stuff that you can't do with print on demand.
Yeah.
But there are actually all sorts of options available which don't cost the earth and do actually produce pretty good results.
Well, if some game designer loved my stories and wanted to do it, I'd be willing. I don't want to be involved too much in the game. I've already got. Yeah,
I'm not trying to send you down a rabbit hole. Don't worry.
If I could do something like you're saying, I mean, I love board game pieces. I love chess. I wish I had more time to play it. I love chess. They even have a Frank Frazetta. Have you seen the Frazetta chess set they've got?
Yes, it's quite something.
Oh, absolutely fantastic. I would love, but it wouldn't have to even that perfectly done. It was just those kind of those iconic things like you're saying that I picture in the story of Sails on Scarlet Sand, almost like a really ancient feel to it, like something that would come from ancient Persia, and that's the game. And you pull out like
that. That's the sort of what's the word? Kind of design palette I've got in my head when I see it. It feels sort of ancient Persian. Yeah,
I mean that story was based on my reading of Freya Stark's books. Definitely Southern Gates of Arabia. I just love the desert stuff, and that I was like, I want to write a story that takes place in the desert, and they're lost in this weird desert. And I always have them like getting whisked off to some other dimension or something. Because
deserts are great places to get lost in, aren't they? Absolutely,
and there's a lot of mystery there, and it's a very perilous place simply by its silence and dryness. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the stories came to me from those kind of, either from reading about natural environments, like Alan Villier's stuff, just traveling in a ship or whatever. And The Farmer's Daughter was based completely on a walk in Topanga Canyon here in California, where my girlfriend used to live.
Oh, really?
Yeah, my girlfriend used to live there, and I was just walking up the hill. It's beautiful. It's canyons. You walk in there. And I walked up, and I just saw the cleft. The sun was setting behind the hills. there's a cleft in the hill and the sun had just gone by in that bright twilight, you know?
Yeah.
And I just stopped. I think I was taking the dog for a walk. I forgot her dog. And I stopped and I just looked up and I get this feeling in my solar plexus, like an opening up. It's like a slight spiritual experience. It's akin to some of the Satori things I've had, but it's more mild, but it's very intense. And I just looked at that cleft and I got that feeling and I just stared at it. And then in my mind, I suddenly thought of Dareon and Blue riding their horses over that cleft. That's it.
Right.
And that's the story. I have no idea what the story is about. And I wrote that. They're riding down into this canyon.
Yeah.
But it's wintertime and it's very desolate. And then they see a farmhouse. And I don't know.
And all the mischief happens from there.
Yes, and maybe the farmer's daughter, the whole limerick, the idea of the poems of the dirty poems of the dirty limericks of the farmer's daughter came into my mind, or stories. So I thought farmer's daughter, and I think, well, who's the farmer? Who's she? So a lot of the stories I would not write for 2 years. I remember another time I was walking into Topanga Canyon, and I thought of a young woman, and a wolf.
Oh, right, yeah.
I thought of a white wolf, and then I thought of a young woman, and then I thought, and she's following Blue or something. And I'm walking into Topanga, and it's California, it's dry, summertime.
Sure.
But I pictured this in the wintertime, and that became Stronger Than Blood. But I didn't write that story for a year or something. It was in my mind, this idea. So I just get these images, and they come from various things. They're very random. It's like dreams. They combine.
Well, I guess that's sort of your job. You don't tend to go around inventing new words terribly often. You take old words and recombine them in ways that haven't been done before. And the same is true with elements of story, I think.
Yes, you're doing images. Well, for me, they are images first. They're always images first. The words come later, so it's not images. It's images in my head, not paintings and stuff. But I've mentioned this before on another show. The mornings in Los Angeles occasionally we get a little bit of fog, but we've had such a drought that finally now we had a almost full June of 5 days a week fog in the morning till 1 p.m. or so, which was amazing because it's just been terribly hot. But there still were some mornings in the last few years that were misty, and I was on a walk here in Silver Lake in the hills. It's very hilly here, and there's the San Gabriel Mountains in the background. So I went for a walk, and I looked, and just rising through the mist, I could see this. It looked like a fortress. And what it is, it's a church. I think it's a church, yeah, because there's a cross at the top. But it's very strange looking. It doesn't look like in my story, the Citadel of the Seven Doors. But I saw this building rising up from the mist, and it was just incredible. I was up on the top of this hill, and it was there not at the foot of the mountains, but in front of the mountains around Glendale area. But you couldn't even see buildings or anything. Just this building. And I just stopped and I looked at it, and there were the mountains that were like ghosts. The mountains were like ghosts in the background, just like a fade. You could barely see the mountains. And again, I got that feeling, and I just stopped. And I stared at this building, and then I started to walk home, and in my mind, this sentence started coming into my head. And I kept rolling it over and over in my head until I got home. And the sentence, by the time I got home, the sentence was, and I had no idea what the building was or what the story was about. So the first sentence is, "The scarlet orb of the day's dying sun was a blade's breadth high in the sullen sky when Dareon and Blue saw the seven-tiered citadel rise from the blood-hued mist." Right. So that sentence inspired.
That's quite a sentence.
Thanks. Well, that's what drives me forward often, is just a really great sentence, a description or a joke or something. So that was it. I had no idea where they were. And then the story unfolded slowly, and it takes time. I try not to fight it too much.
Sure.
Whatever's interesting in my mind, I put down, and then I just wait.
Well, as Hazel O'Connor put into one of her songs, you can't push the river faster than it's meant to go.
I'm such a believer in that. I really am. And there's sometimes I wish I could write more than I do or faster. But the truth is, when I get momentum, it comes out pretty fast. So I tend to wait, almost like a spring, and don't try to dig too deep. And I do what I can
Yeah,
to stay inspired. I keep the stories open on my computer, and I'm out on my terrace in the late afternoon. I'm half asleep and need to take a nap, and I'll just do some reading and meditating, and I just keep all the things I'm working on open, and I go over, write something, go back, write something. It's like whatever comes to me.
And so you can just pick up whichever is kind of foremost in your mind.
Yeah, I'm working on I'm working on a novel that's about a quarter way through, another novel that's just in gestation, and then at least two short stories and Dareon's preludes that will go to the beginning of the second volume. But I'm not like actively trying to work on all of them. Well, I'm working on them all the time. I keep them open, and whichever one I feel inspired to work on, I go, because otherwise it becomes joyless to me. I can't.
Yeah, that's pretty much my process. I show up at my desk in the morning not knowing what I'm going to do, and then if I'm in the right sort of headspace, a whole bunch of useful stuff gets done, and then I realize I'm done and I stop.
Yeah.
And that it's not usually like I have to write this chunk of text today, or I have to shoot these videos today. It's okay, well, what videos am I going to shoot today? That one.
Yeah.
And so when I'm producing stuff, it very rarely comes out in sequential order. It's whatever happens to be sort of loaded up into the buffer during the night, and it's just ready to come out the next day. And it could be something I haven't even thought about for 6 months, and suddenly it's ready.
Right. Yeah, it's a very mysterious, unconscious process, and I respect it a great deal, and I feel very strongly we are kind of, I don't like the word channeling because it sounds very new age, but we are very much channeling kind of something either from our subconscious or from a collective unconscious or whatever. We talked about that even a bit, I think, last time you were on the show, and that's why I didn't write the Dareon of Blue stories in order. And that's why, for the second book, I'm not writing them in order either. I'm doing the same thing. I'm just writing whatever I really am enthralled by.
Whatever's ready.
Yes, whatever's ready, whatever's being given to me. And I just feel like grace to me. And I am proud of some of the stories I've written, but sometimes I look back at the first book, and I'm talking to you now about how they came together, but the truth is, I'm like, how did I write that? I don't have any idea. I don't, like I just told you about the building and the blood you'd missed. I don't remember how I came up with any of the rest of it.
But the trick is you showed up to your computer in the right state of mind.
Right.
That's how you did it, I think.
See, that's what I think, a respect for the work and of that being in the present moment, the gratefulness of what you have. I feel like if you are trying to finish the book, or you're thinking of getting published or getting a story in the magazine, or this has to be finished by this time, you're not present. You're it's like an act of violence against your story to me. I know it may be a strange thing to say, but it is like an act of violence against yourself, your mind, your story. But
there is also the discipline of actually showing up.
But that's not violent. That's not violent.
That's just
it's a very different.
Creating the space for the stuff to happen in.
That's called the work.
Yes, exactly.
That's the work. It's like, so when you're working out, you're trying to build muscle, you don't push yourself too far because you'll tear your muscle, and you don't berate yourself if you can't lift a certain amount. It's completely counterproductive, and that is violence against yourself. So, and it would take the joy out of it. I mean, it's already difficult enough to work out, to lift weights or something, Might as well put some music on and get pumped up and be grateful that your arms work.
Yes.
And that's kind of my feeling about it is I'm writing that story, the Star Diamonds. I'm just so unbelievably thrilled with it, and I had to really fight for it. It's sometimes it's just great from the start. I feel like it's really happening. Other times it's like I just don't know what's happening. I have to keep going, and then I reach the tipping point, and I'm like, I've got it. And then I start revising. Then I start getting very excited about it. And I was like, God, this story is what I would have wanted to read if Leiber or Fritz Leiber, Michael Moorcock, Robert E. Howard, Jack Vance, Seymour, if they were writing. This is a story I would want to read. And that makes me very happy when I feel like because that's really what I'm doing. I'm writing stories because
you want to read them.
Yes, I want to read them. I can't enjoy them as other people can, but I can enjoy the process of writing them. And there are parts where you feel like it's being read to you almost.
Indeed.
And so I I want to give people that same joy that I had. And those writers I just mentioned to me are the kind of the five. And there were others that contributed definitely, but I think that, so I'm not meaning any disrespect to the other writers, including like Powell Andersen and some of the great, there were some other great writers. He contributed a great deal, actually, The Broken Sword and Three Hearts and Three Lions. But for me, I mean, so just personally for me, those five, that's why I wanted to write. And that's what really, I loved Lord of the Ring, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, but it was a different feeling. It was like, I think Tolkien is really great at putting across, I think he made me love nature. I think Tolkien's contribution to me was a love of the land. And if I ever want to get inspired, I feel like I'm not inspired in my writing of the land. Howard was very good at times. His description was beautiful, visceral, but poetic. But Tolkien, if you read, man, his love of England and wherever, Ireland just comes through of the land. And it is ponderous at times, but especially Fellowship of the Ring.
Which is basically just a very long walk in the countryside.
Yes. And that's why I love that book the most. That's why I can read that book every 3 or 4 years. I read the Fellowship of the Ring. I never get through the whole trilogy again, but I love that book, and I loved his love of the land. That's what I learned from him. And I don't try to imitate. See, the mistake is to try to imitate it. Then you're just, it's hopeless. You're going to write the most insipid stuff. And that's what unfortunately has happened a fair amount. But he wrote what he knew and loved. And that's what you have to do. You have to write. And so my land, Plamora, I don't want to get off on I'm going to go back to the authors in a second, because that's really what I want to talk about. But the influence of my book is being in California. I mean, it's the travel stuff I read. A lot of it's my love of California and the Mediterranean, and California is the closest to the Mediterranean that you get. That's not the Mediterranean. So it's California, because San Francisco's on the same latitude. Thanks. I was going to say longitude. Same latitude, and the weather's very similar. And LA is very similar to. It feels like you're in the Mediterranean. So my love of the Mediterranean and that whole area, Northern Africa, and Greece, Italy, that area, Persia, that whole area around the Mediterranean is where I have some stories take place in the Stronger Than Blood, or the northern adventures in the snow and that. But if you read the first book, especially, even the cover is that gold, dripping amber gold color, and so it's California sunshine. It's just most of the stories. It doesn't rain outside. It does inside from someplace I'm not going to mention, and to not have a spoiler, but I don't think it rains in a single story in the first book.
I don't remember much, apart from that one, that indoor.
Right, the Citadel, Seven Doors. But yeah, it's mostly sunny, or it's at night, and it's in summertime or whatever, and even if it's fall, but it's usually. So that was a huge thing for me, and that's what I write. The World of Plamora. There's a map in the front, and I talked about that in another show.
Yeah, I think the map is one of my favorite things, particularly the admonition, because you managed to get the word torpescence into a note.
Yeah, the archivist's note.
That's fantastic.
I don't want to be self-indulgent. I read that in another episode, but the map was something I did because I thought people would want it, and I didn't want it to inhibit me. So that's why I included that archivist's note. Well, I'll go ahead and read it. It says, and this is in the Quill stories too. I think it was originally for the Quill stories because it's the same world, and those are even more comedic. But because it says prepared, the map, Western Plamora, prepared by Robert Zoltan from a map by Randamel, the map maker. And there's a little note. It says, archivist's note, this map is based on a wholly incomplete and inaccurate map of Western Plamora prepared by Randamel, the map maker. Called by some the armchair cartographer, Randamel was infamous for his laxity, torpescence, and both cultural and geographical prejudices. Sadly, his is one of the few surviving maps of Western Plamora from Plamora's Middle Age. And then there's a warning. It says, warning, this map is useful for entertainment purposes only. It's kind of the final hi-hat hit there. I wanted to free myself from being, the part of it was because I wanted to free myself from being trapped by my map. Because it's just, it's like Leiber said. He said he didn't know anything more about the world of Nehwon than was written in the story. So the 5 authors that the most magical to me and that kind of just changed my world from the time I was around in junior high. I started discovering these things would be Fritz Leiber, Jack Vance, Robert E. Howard, Michael Moorcock, and C.L. Moore. And all of them brought something completely different to what became modern fantasy. And the two, probably, if I had to pick my 2 favorites, it would be Jack Vance and Fritz Leiber. But it's hard for me even to say that. Right when I say that, Catherine Moore, C.L. Moore, strangely, I did not read her until a few years ago. And in some ways, I feel that she was easily as good as the other 4, and she brought something to it, and partly maybe because she was a woman that is so unlike any of the others. Her stories are seldom, there's barely any action in those stories, and yet they're mesmerizing, and she could describe emotion like no one else could. And if I would recommend all those authors highly, of course, to everyone. But C.L. Moore's stories, I reread those because I'm astonished. They seem very much alike. I'm talking about the Jirel of Joiry stories and the Northwest Smith stories. The Northwest Smith stories are almost supposed to be science fiction space opera, but they're just the same as the Jirel of Joiry stories. It doesn't matter. The fantasy and science fiction she wrote the same way. And those had a sense of mystery, that numinous mystery that no other author really captured like she did. A real sense of strangeness and emotional strangeness and weirdness that goes far beyond what Lovecraft did or anyone else did, in my opinion. Not in the sense of creating a genre of gods and all that. I'm not talking about the material, technical aspects. I'm talking about the poetry and emotive, dreamlike quality of the writing. And apart from her, Leiber created to me the most mysterious, with his use of synchronicity and some of the amazing stories with Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse, or how the story ends. Very much how with my stories, they seldom win by their wits, definitely not by their swords. Only occasionally does it helps them, but they win by some strange luck or synchronicity or coincidence of events. And that's what Leiber did with many of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories. They had a sense of chance and a sense of an alignment, a mysterious alignment of things that saved them in the end, or allowed them to win. And that to me is what I feel like that reflects life more. We kind of use our skills and we use our wisdom and all this, but in the end, we're sometimes just by some weird event, things work out. And I see that happening a lot.
Wouldn't it be wonderful to think that maybe some writer as yet unborn will be saying exactly the same things about your Rogues of Merth stories in 50 years' time or so?
Oh, yeah.
It's something to aim for, isn't it?
I try not to think about it. That's a wonderful thing to say. I'll be honest with you, maybe that's what authors think of. I've never even thought of it.
No?
I'll probably be gone, and it won't matter to me anymore.
No, sure.
But I want people to feel joy, and I want people to enjoy the stories. But if there's anything else I do want them to take away from it, it is what I got from Leiber, and especially Leiber and Catherine Moore, maybe, and that is a sense of wonder in the world, and a sense of mystery, that not mystery like a mystery novel. I'm talking about the numinous, the incomprehensible, the truly mysterious, of the existential mystery. That is something that may terrify us at times, but it can also bring joy. It's a not being afraid to let that in, because there's a great amount of joy there, and I think there's something there that we're connected to that's way beyond not only the discussion of this show, but the discussion period. And that's what I think great literature can do, and great art can do. It can open up what Joseph Campbell, he quoted a psychologist that called it works of art, writing, whatever, that are transparent to transcendence. So in my books, in my stories, I'm really trying to get out of the way. I am trying to get out of the way, and I'm trying to just, the muse or whatever, let it come through. And I want to write something that actually has some actual value and meaning, not in a preachy sense, but just as a doorway or a window to some joy or mystery or bliss. That's the best way I guess I can describe it. Which is connected to childhood to me, I think.
I can't think of a better note to end on. So thank you, Robert, for taking your surprise so on the chin, and thank you also to Edgar for setting you up and setting this up.
Yeah,
it's been a pleasure to be here.
Well, thanks so much for doing this. I'm thanking you, and I will punish Edgar.
None of that gourmet bird food for him. You can feed him on the regular kind.
No, he's got some surprises coming up. He'll find out. So I guess this is the first time. I guess we'll be hanging up the dream phone on the host.
Indeed.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Guy.
You're most welcome.
It was wonderful. Thanks. Talk soon.
Yeah, take care.
See, that wasn't so bad, was it?
No, I guess not. It was fun, actually. Just don't let it happen again.
Hey, with me, always expect the unexpected.
Back at you, pal. Guess what I purchased at the pet store?
Ah! Cat food! Is this some kind of joke? I'm not eating that.
No, you're not. The cat is.
What cat? We don't have a cat.
We don't have a cat yet.
What? Gah!